Hello, welcome. Tonight we are very delighted to have Chris Emms for the summer program public lecture series. Chris is a PhD candidate at McMaster University, and his research mostly focuses on the Vinaya literature. He is also a very admired Sanskrit lecturer at Rangjung Yeshe Institute. The title of his talk for today is Organizing the Vinaya, Щākyaprabha'sArrangement of Novice Precepts and Offenses. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, everybody. Am I okay mic-wise? Do I need to slide in a little? This is good. You can tell who's done Sanskrit when they pronounce the title of your thing and they say the name Щākyaprabhā correctly. Thank you, everybody, for coming here. Much appreciated. All right. We might as well get started. I'm a little under the weather, so I apologize. If things get too boring, it's just the food poisoning, not the topic. So today I'm going to chat a little bit about, to start, the Vinaya or monastic law. Then we're going to briefly wander into the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya, a Vinaya of a particular school. We're going to talk a little bit about the scope and size of this school. Then we're going to wander into talking about Щākyaprabhā and his Vinaya commentaries for novices. And then we're going to talk about the sort of structure and organization of this text. And then end by discussing the role of a little-known text called the Vinayavibhāṣa as a source for Щākyaprabhā's work. And then we're going to see that the verses from the Vinayavibhāṣa are embedded in a different Sanskrit Vinaya commentary. So first, a little bit about the Vinaya. Being here, I don't have to probably say too much about this, which is kind of nice. Generally, early Buddhist canons are split up into three baskets for the Tripitaka, Sutra, Vinaya, and Abhidharma. So, the Vinaya that we're going to be talking about today is the part of the basket or the Buddhist canon, thought to be words of the Buddha, that contains, monastic regulations, so rules for monks and nuns and that kind of stuff. Before we talk about the Vinaya, because it's dealing with things like monastic regulations, we can talk maybe a little bit about the early Sangha. We don't have an abundance of information about this, but we think that the earliest Buddhist communities were probably primarily itinerant, so wandering around the majority of the time. But it seems that even this being the case, relatively early on, we have the development of monasteries and nunneries, so early on in the development of the tradition. And so essentially what would happen is that monks and nuns would spend the rainy season during these monasteries or nunneries, so that they weren't traveling around and damaging life, essentially. That being said, by the 1st century BCE or probably earlier, we have what seems to be like a pretty fully developed monastic institution. And it seems that by this time, monks and nuns primarily lived full-time in monasteries or nunneries. Not exclusively. Vinaya literature sort of like talks essentially about like two groups of people, maybe sort of like city monastics and then forest monastics, so people who would like live primarily inside a monastery or nunnery, and then those who might, spend more time outside of it. And so the Vinaya literature, or the literature for monks and nuns that we have, our monastic regulations, assume a relatively settled monastic life. So it seems like by the times our texts are, in the versions that we have them now, we sort of assume that, primarily monks and nuns are living settled lives. And so the Vinaya, the monastic law code, contains regulations for individual monastic figures, as well as things like the successful operation of monastic communities. This is the Jetavana, which is, an important monastery, shows up in like our very earliest Buddhist art. A little bit in terms of like Buddhist schools, there is supposedly, depending on like what text you read, 18 Buddhist schools. Some say that there are actually 20 of these. And if you like read the lists of things, sorry if that's a little echoey, it sounds like it is to me. If we read the list of these 18 schools, different texts don't agree with each other. So we don't really know exactly like how many schools there were, or if like things changed over time and groups renamed and things of that nature. We kind of assume, but we don't really know if all of them had their own Vinaya or monastic law code. It seems likely that probably they did, but just because of like the sources we have available to us, we don't really know for sure. In terms of like how this literature gets passed around early on, as was the case, you have sort of like specialists in like a specific part of the Buddhist canon, and it would be their sort of like job to recite the Vinaya or to recite the Sutra, or perhaps to recite the Abhidharma or Matrika, as it's sometimes called early on. So our earliest, Vinaya transmission is, done orally. Because of this, and because of how manuscripts work in the Indian subcontinent, it's pretty hard to determine the exact date of composition of specific Vinayas, and probably this varied by school. So what do we have in terms of like actual Vinaya texts? We have 6 complete, let's say, extant Vinayas. It's a complete in quotation marks because we don't really know what a complete Vinaya was, or if that was even like a thing that people thought of. We have Vinayas as they have them. They seem to have, largely the same parts. So these are probably like relatively complete, let's say, monastic law codes. These sort of break down, as is the case, depending on how much one knows about, the development of Buddhist schools. We have sort of like a Mahasangika group, and then a Theravādan group. And we have a Mahasangika Vinaya preserved in Chinese translation. On the Mahasangika side, we do have some sort of like offshoots, some Lokottara text preserved in Sanskrit adjacent languages as well, but we seem to have the whole thing in quotation marks preserved in Chinese. On the Theravādan side of things, we also have 5 schools. So the Dharmaguptaka and Mahishasaka, both preserved in the Chinese canon. We have the Mūlasarvāstivāda that we're going to talk about today, which is preserved in Tibetan and then partially in Chinese and Sanskrit. The Sarvāstivādin Vinaya, preserved in Chinese, and then the Theravādan, or specifically the Mahaviharan Theravādan, which is preserved in Pali. So these are like the full Vinayas that we have today. So now I want to talk a little bit about just sort of like the general structure of like what the Vinaya is like as a body of texts. Essentially, we have sort of like 3 things, or 2 things, and sometimes 3 things, depending on school. One, we have a section called the Vinayavibhāṣa, or Sutta Vibhanga in Pali, which is something like the explanation of the Vinaya, sort of like a more in-depth discussion of things, still considered to be though the words of the Buddha. Then we have a section called the Vinayavastu, which is really just like the chapter on the Vinaya, not too descriptive of a title. And then for some schools, we have sort of like an additional section of texts, which maybe we would call like supplements. We don't have them for all of the schools that we have Vinaya material for, but certain ones we do have additional information that's part of their canon. So let's talk a little bit about the Vibhanga. The Vinayavibhāṣa is structured around a text called the Pratimoksha Sutra, or Patimokkha Sutta in Pali. We think probably this is the oldest of our Vinaya material. Again, it's hard to tell, but within this text, there are like certain rules that, based on sort of like linguistic evidence, we think are probably from about the earliest we're going to get for Vinaya literature. Our Pratimoksha Sutras contain, individual rules for monastics, so like personal rules for personal behavior. These Pratimoksha Sutra rules were recited fortnightly at Poshita ceremonies, or Posita, so sort of like every 2 weeks, monastics would get together and recite or go over this text to ensure that everybody in the community was pure. Pure meaning pure of the sort of infractions in this text. Because the way the Pratimoksha Sutra is structured is essentially by severity of offenses. This is only kind of generally true, but we have sort of like the heavier things at the top, expulsion. Then we move into offenses penalized by things like suspension and forfeiture, confession, and then sort of like smaller things that you just like wouldn't do again, or try not to do. Because of the sort of like vast, amount of variety inside of this text, we have rules covering everything from like murder to like sitting postures, right? So the Pratimoksha covers like all sorts of different things. In terms of rules, this varies depending on the school. On the monk side of, depending on whether we have monks or nuns, on the monk side of things, we have, about 230-ish or something like that. So between 218 and 263, depending on the school. And the nuns generally have about 100 additional rules. So between 277 on the low end and 380 on the high end, rules for nuns in the Nuns Bhikshuni Pratimoksha Sutra. So this is how the Vibhanga works. We have a Pratimoksha Sutra, it's got its rules, and then the Vibhanga is structured sort of like around this text. This is basically how things work. We have some sort of introductory narrative where a monk or nun, or as is often the case in the Vinaya, specific groups of monks and nuns who are regularly getting into trouble, act in some sort of problematic way. It's not necessarily some sort of like offense. Usually the lay people hear about it and it's a problem. The Buddha is informed. And then we get to the Buddha sort of like promulgating the rule that we have in the Pratimoksha Sutra. We get things like definitions of individual words so that it's clear exactly like what a rule means. And then we have other information as well, sort of like emendations, degrees of infractions, exceptions, like situations where there's not an offense and that sort of stuff. So various sort of like legal maneuverings. So for example, in the regulation against murder, the sort of like general way that this works is that the Buddha has taught meditation exercises on disgust of the body to sort of like prevent things like desire and attachment. People get a little bit confused, monks and nuns thinking about the disgusting nature of their body start committing suicide or hiring killers is sort of like the sort of like main narrative thing that happens in this text. A specific assassin, he is sometimes a monk and sometimes not a monk depending on the school. The Buddha comes back and asks Ananda where everybody went, and he sort of explains what happens. This is just like kind of how these stories go. There's a problem, something happens, the Buddha hears about it, and then we get a rule, right? So he hears about it. So the Buddha gives the regulation against murdering human beings, right? So he's given this teaching, there's problems. He says, don't kill people. And then after this, we get sort of additional information that sort of like fleshes out the rule. So we get more narrative stories. This is going to cover sort of like directly relevant material, things like assisted suicide, encouraging death, abortion, like what constitutes a human being, all that sort of stuff gets covered in here as well. And then eventually, after our various like stories and changes, we get the Pratimoksha Sutra rule in the Vibhanga as we have it in the sutra, the one that gets recited. And the one that gets followed. So that's the Vibhanga, structured around the Pratimoksha, individual rules for monks and nuns. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the vastus or chapters. Just like the way that the Vibhanga is structured around sort of like individual rules, the vastu section is structured around karmas or maybe like ecclesiastical actions. These are often also grouped together in specific texts. They have various names, one of which is karma vachana. The vastus are basically organized into more vastus. So the chapter section is organized into more chapters. These have different names and stuff in different vinayas, but they basically cover the same sort of material. The vastu side of things is more about sort of like regulation of a monastic community. So maybe more sort of like corporate law or like law that governs like the Sangha as a body. So this is going to cover things like ordination, how to run a rains retreat, like what is the appropriate use of leather and hides, medicine, the relationships between monasteries and nunneries, this sort of material. So we have various karmas or ecclesiastical actions. We have our chapters sort of like structured around this, and they're going to cover various aspects of, sort of corporate law. It too is structured around frame stories. This is going to come more into play shortly, where basically like something happens and then we get sort of like the establishment of various things, like say the Poshita ceremony, or like specifics about how ordination is going to work. Now I want to talk about a specific Vinaya, the Vinaya of the Mūlasarvāstivādins. So what do we know about the Mūlasarvāstivādin school? Prominent in the northern part of the Indian subcontinent, particularly popular, it seems, in the northwest, and then to some extent also in the northeast. Also, in other places, Afghanistan, and other parts of South Asia. Their Vinaya was originally composed in Sanskrit. Depending on the school, the sort of like language of composition varies. We know now recently that there really are sort of like multiple Vinaya traditions within this one group. So there isn't just like the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya and it's like one text. We have essentially sort of like multiple narrative traditions within this one group. We don't know as much about other groups, but it seems likely that for other Vinayas, this is the case as well. Maybe in terms of like its final composition, the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya is composed later than other Vinayas. Again, it's tough to tell, right? Because dating things is so hard. especially in classical India where no one is writing things down in terms of having dates. But what do we know? It portrays sort of like a particularly well-established monastic tradition. So for example, like in the Theravada Vinaya, we don't have rules for like really elaborate monasteries in like the Vinaya proper, but we do in the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya have rules for like, like 7-floor monasteries, 5-floor nunneries. We get things like a specific location of a shrine hall within a monastery. This is again something that happens in other places, but isn't necessarily like enshrined in their Vinaya. So maybe it's later, or maybe it was supplementary material that got added to those schools at a later time. Again, hard for us to tell. We do see in the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya a good amount of interest in like not offending the laity, right? The Sangha as a monastic institution relies to some extent on donations. This was the case, thousands of years ago. And so, keeping the laity happy for various reasons is important. One, for their own sort of like spiritual progress, but two, also in terms of like successful operations of monasteries. We do also see more influence, it seems, of Brahmanical ideals. This is probably related to the fact that the Mūlasarvāstivādins were like a North Indian school where we had like a greater influence of Brahmanical culture than we did in other parts of India at the time. But we see things in the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya like rules on taxes, tariffs, very specific things like what happens if you fly over top of a sort of like tariff boundary, do you have to pay taxes on it? So like pretty nitty gritty in terms of like how taxes work. Things about division of property at death and what exactly happens with it. And these seem to be sort of keeping in mind what's happening on the Brahminical side of things as well. And perhaps we see a little bit of a greater stress on purity in terms of like things that you don't want to do in front of the public, because they might think that actions are impure. Mūlasarvāstivādins, North Indian group, more of a focus on purity in sort of like the Brahmanical world at the time. So perhaps it sort of bleeds into the Vinaya. Again, we don't know when it sort of like enters its like final version that we have now. Again, probably like parts of it are older and parts of it are newer. 2nd century-ish CE has been sort of like proposed as this time. But again, we don't know. A little bit in terms of like, what do we have of it? So the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya is preserved completely, or maybe almost completely, in classical Tibetan, translated, between the 8th and 9th century CE, but probably practically the early 9th century CE. I say almost completely because 1, we don't know what a complete Vinaya is, and 2, because there are a few texts in classical Chinese that aren't in the Tibetan version of the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya, sort of like collections of sort of summarizing verses. So we have about 2/3 of it preserved in the Chinese canon, translated by Yi Jing in the 8th century CE. And then we have it partially preserved, maybe like, I don't know, 1/4 or 1/3 or something in classical Sanskrit. Only the Vastu sections, and even like some of these are damaged. Based on, when, the scripts at the time were used, it seems like probably 5th to 6th century CE. These manuscripts were discovered in Gilgit in modern day Pakistan. And so we think probably around then is when, these manuscripts, or at least are from. So, composition predates that. We also have fragments of them in various Central Asian languages. For all the Tokharian fans out there, we have Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya fragments in Tokharian B. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya in terms of like, its like makeup and why it's a little bit different than Vinayas of other schools. Its chapter section, or Vinaya Vastu, only has 17 chapters. Usually most schools have 20. It has a Vinayavibhāṣa, which we talked about, right? Structured around the Pratimoksha Sutra. It has as its own sort of like separate section, something called the Vinaya Kshudraka or Kshudraka Vastu, which is just sort of like the chapters on miscellaneous stuff. This exists in other schools, but it's like pretty small. But in the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya, it's, like 2 volumes in Tibetan, and it encompasses what in other schools floats around in the Vinaya Vastu. So those like 3 other chapters are inside this. We also have a text called the Uttara Grantha, or maybe Uttama Grantha. We are unclear exactly which it is, because it exists in 2 parts in the Tibetan translation, and the names are slightly different from each other. Maybe it means something like the ultimate text. And it is a collection of 10 or 11, depending on how you count, additional sort of like Vinaya things, considered certainly canonical Vinaya. Some like very important rules are contained in this section of like supplementary material. So it's not really supplementary. It's just like texts that like fit into like a different category. So we've got this fourfold, as we know it, Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya. So let's talk a little bit about size. The Vinaya is not just a collection of monastic regulations and legalese. It contains extensive narrative material. So the frame stories in the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya are like way bigger and more elaborate than they are in the Vinayas of other schools. So we see, for example, Vishvamtara Jataka. We have Jatakas or past life stories of the Buddha included inside of the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya. We have like full sutras, big ones too, Mahasutras preserved inside of the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya. We also have extensive amounts of avadanas. These are past life stories of Buddhist figures who are not the Buddha, essentially. And, you know, we have all of this like fancy narrative material, fantastic stories. I would highly recommend that everybody read them, that got pulled out of the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya and then placed into story collections that seem to have been popular in general. So we have texts like the Avadana Shataka and the Divyavadana story collections. And for example, you know, the Divyavadana, like a lot of it is narrative from the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya that got taken out and then put into this narrative collection. So it's big. How big is it? It's 13 volumes in Tibetan, like good sized volumes. By doing a little bit of like fancy math, by that I mean basic multiplication and addition, which to me is fancy math. It seems like in Sanskrit it was the equivalent of about 100,000 shlokas or units of verse. In terms of like how big that is, you know, the biggest of our other Vinayas, the Sarvastivada and Dharmaguptaka Vinayas are, you know, it's 4 times bigger than those. At 100,000 shlokas, it is also bigger than the Ramayana and the Mahabharata in the critical editions, right? So, you know, great Indian epics, the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya, bigger than those are. So what do you do with it? How do you use a text that's big? And do you use it, right? If it's that giant. Maybe we get a little hint about how one navigates this body of literature. If we look at like how I Ching translates stuff. So he translated our Mūlasarvāstivādin text, well, him and his translation team translated our Mūlasarvāstivādin text into Chinese. The first thing that he translates before any canonical Vinaya, Buddha Vachana stuff, is he translates the Vinayavibhāṣa. The Vinayavibhāṣa is a sort of like verse commentary digest of the whole Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya. So the first thing that gets translated by him isn't, you know, the Vinaya proper. It's a commentary that summarizes it. It seems was particularly popular in India when he was there. So commentaries, digests, things like that. We have them of other schools. We have one Mahasangika one. We have one Dharmaguptaka one. We have one Sarvastivādan one. Theravada side of things a little bit trickier. We had some, seems the earliest ones were lost, but they do have like a pretty extensive commentarial tradition. Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya has 34 commentaries preserved in Tibetan, 3 preserved in Chinese, as well as commentaries in Dunhuang in Chinese and Tibetan that are Mūlasarvāstivādin that we don't have preserved elsewhere. So extensive commentarial tradition, digest tradition, perhaps because of the somewhat unruly size of the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya, right? As a text that like contains rules for like monks and nuns and monastic operations, 100,000 verses is pretty long. 13 volumes is pretty long. So now we're going to talk about what Щākyaprabhā does, a Vinaya specialist in terms of navigating the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya. He wrote 2 texts originally in Sanskrit that are now just preserved in the Tibetan canon, the Āryamūlasarvāstivādiśrāmaṇerakārikā, which I'm just going to call Karika, verses for novices of the Noble Mūlasarvāstivādins. And then he wrote an autocommentary, aka his own commentary, on his text called the Āryamūlasarvāstivādiśrāmaṇerakārikā Vritti Prabhavati, which we're just going to call Prabhavati from now on. Maybe something like the illuminating commentary of the verses for novices of the Noble Mūlasarvāstivādins. That's at least how the Tibetan reads. The Sanskrit at the end, little dicey. So what do we know about Щākyaprabhā? Writing in the 7th to 8th century CE, it seems. Also within the Tibetan canon, we have two Indic Vinaya commentaries that refer to him. The Щākyaprabha'sArrangement Sutra by Āryamūlasarvāstivādin, who wrote a whole bunch of commentaries, and we don't know when he was alive or anything. And then Vinayavibhāṣa, who we do kind of know when he was alive, wrote a specific commentary on the Karika, or Щākyaprabhā's verse text, the Trishatakārika Vyakhyāna. So we know based on various things that at least he's writing before this guy writes a commentary on. And we know that his work is important enough that, you know, Kalyanamitra and Vinayavibhāṣa, pretty hefty commentators, took his work to be authoritative enough that they wrote commentaries on it or specifically referred to it. In Kalyanamitra's text, he says, like, basically I use Щākyaprabhā's text and all the other stuff comes from my teacher in good classical Indian fashion. So we know kind of when he was alive, and we know the text that he wrote, and we know that he was influential. But we don't know too much about him. He refers to his preceptor, Punyakirti, and a guru of his, kshaktyaprabha, in his text, in his auto-commentary. He composed the Karika on behalf of someone named Shakyamitra, thought to be his student. Later Tibetan tradition holds that he was from Kashmir. We don't know for sure, but that is at least how things show up. We do know, though, that he wrote or studied at Nalanda, the great, you know, Buddhist monastic institution that we see there, / library. In Tibet, Щākyaprabhā, together with Gunaprabha, was and is considered one of the two superiors of Indian Buddhism for proficiency in Vinaya. This group of two is often paired together with the 6 ornaments, so Nagarjuna, Sangha, Dignaga, Aryadeva, Vasubandhu, and Dharmakirti. So, you know, like pretty big names, pretty important people that he gets to be associated with. Now we're going to talk a little bit about his text. So he's a specialist in Indian monastic law. Essentially what he does is he summarizes proper behavior for shramaneres, or male novices, in 238 verses. Despite the fact that this text is sometimes called the 300-verse text, as somebody who works on this text, you can't quite really get to 300, no matter how you like cut things up. So it's about 238, with like shaving off a little bit of a verse somewhere. And then he has his own commentary on this text, his Prabhavati, where he like comments on his verses and explains things. So he gives examples, definitions, explains words, all the things one does in a Shastra or an Indian commentary. He also does something which is nice for me, who works on this stuff. He provides over 250 quotations from the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya in his text. So he'll like say something, and then he'll be like, the kshudraka says, and then he'll provide a quote from the kshudraka. And so we can see how much it agrees with or doesn't agree with versions that we have today. Since he's talking about novices, we should talk about ordination just for a second. So shramaneras, or novices, undertaken pravrajya, or going forth. So not ordination, or sometimes people call it full ordination. And we see here in between, only because I'm going to talk about it very briefly, you know, on the nun side of things, we have sort of like secondary probationary period for women in between being a novice and being a fully ordained nun. So we're talking about novices. In general, regardless of school, male and female novices take the same 10 shikshapadas, or precepts, or trainings. The order varies depending on the traditions, but they're basically this: abstaining from killing, stealing, sex, false speech, intoxicants, singing and dancing, and such things, wearing garlands, jewelry, perfumes, sleeping on fancy beds, like high and really nice, eating after noon, and touching gold, silver, and other valuables. So these are your 10 normal, let's say in quotation mark, novice precepts. As you might suspect, since the Karika is 238 verses long, it doesn't really just cover these 10 things. What happens is that Щākyaprabhā pulls relevant material for novices from across the enormous Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya together. Some of these rules come from the section on, you know, individual rules for monks and nuns, right, to the Pratimoksha / Vibhanga, but also a lot of it comes from the Vinayavibhāṣa, the miscellaneous section, and then this Uttara Grantha with its additional material. There's a lot actually in this text from the Uttara Grantha. So how is it sort of arranged? Basically, the way that it's arranged is that the first 10 sections of his text follow the 10 precepts in the order of the Mūlasarvāstivādin school. So that means that there's like a killing section, and then a stealing section, and then a sex section, and then all the way through the 10 novice precepts. And then each of these sections, he has like a bunch of verses that are like kind of about the same kind of stuff. Strangely, the Karka doesn't end with 10, but instead has 4 additional novice precepts. So his text doesn't just have 10 novice precepts, it has 14. This is relatively unique. The one commentary that comments upon him has the first 12 of them, but otherwise you generally only see, like, with the specific term like precepts, you only see like 10. So the 10 is our first 10 that we just looked at: killing, stealing, sex, lying about, supernatural attainments, intoxicants, all that sort of stuff. And then we have 4 additional precepts. What is related to abandoning the marks of the householder? What is related to destroying the marks of going forth? Right, that is the thing one does to become a novice. Breaks the request for ordination to the guru. And then what is related to what breaks the entire vow? So we have 4 additional precepts included in his text that are all related to something. The text, as I said, arranged into, like, sections based on the novice precepts. This basically coincides with like what kind of offense one commits. So Щākyaprabha'sArrangement kind of like lays this out in a verse. If you do like the 4, killing, stealing, sex, lying about, supernatural powers thing, there's a fall from novicehood. As it is for a monk, so it is for a novice. Afterwards, there is no opportunity for generating the vow. And then when we move into the next 6, so intoxicants, wearing garlands, using high beds, things like that, this is a dushkrita of confession, so a misdeed that one needs to confess. And then if you transgress what is related, which is novice precepts 11 to 14, the new precepts, as well as some other things we'll see, then it is a fault that is to be censured. This is settled. This is a good way to say, like, you're done talking about something in an Indian commentary. That's enough of this. So let's look a little bit about how this works. Basically, we have a main precept: killing, stealing, whatever. Depending on what the thing is, defeat or you have to confess it. Then we have some verses that are like variations and extenuating circumstances, let's say. And then after this, we have a section called related offenses, which are like minor things that you don't do again. So for example, if we look at killing, we get the first verse in the killing section. This is going to give you a real sense of like what some Vinaya is like. Whatever novice in a regular state of mind, possessing the training, perceiving a human, and with the thought of killing without error, attacks another human, and if the human dies, excluding when dreaming, he becomes destroyed. So, right, we need all of these, and this is how, monastic legal literature works. What happens to you if you're involved in something involving death is pretty important. It's a pretty big deal. So we have our main precept, which is killing. So killing is this. This is killing a person. You have to see that they're a human. You have to do it on purpose. You can't make a mistake, and so on. Then we wander in the sort of extenuating circumstances section. This is going to be of things like killing insects when you're drinking water, something you definitely don't want to do as a novice. It's also going to be things like, likewise, there is the ultimate offense for one that, having transformed into a form of an animal appearance, kills a person. So if you magically transform into an animal and kill somebody, if you know that you're an ascetic, then it is one of these like murder defeats. But if you don't, then it's a sort of like small offense, right? So extenuating circumstances going to be like situations that might arise. And then it's like, well, what happens in the situation? And so we have rules for what happens in that situation. So they go into this sort of like extenuating circumstances section of the text. And then we get related offenses. I'm just going to sort of bang them out here. Creates the absence of food out of anger, sends somebody who's exhausted, turns a thief over to a king, what's going to happen to them. Creates occasion for worry, squeezes, tickles, starts a forest fire, breaks an underdeveloped skin lesion, cuts or similarly pierces the limb. These are certainly related to killing and is one of these sort of minor misdeeds. And these are just examples. So we have related stuff, and the related stuff is things like, being like, yeah, I saw that thief over there. when you know what's going to happen to them. And then other things that might to non-Vinaya people seem kind of strange, like tickling. But in the story about tickling, somebody dies from being tickled, and so it's bad. That is why it is in this section. Well, that's one of the reasons it's in this section. So the first two parts of this seem pretty logical. You got your main rule, killing, stealing, having sex, and then you get sort of extenuating circumstances, like when is this not an offense? What happens if this slightly modified version of it happens? But then we have all these like related things. Why exactly they're related to, killing or whatever, isn't always immediately clear. And this is mostly what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this. If you commit one of these related precepts, you commit a samvarakaraniya, which just means that like you vow not to do it again, sort of. Sort of like you feel bad about it, and then you like in your head say like, I'm not going to do it. So we have these related rules that have this type of sort of like minor, way to deal with them for our 10 normative novice precepts and all of our new precepts, right? Our new precepts, what is related to abandoning the marks, what is related to, what is related to, what is related to. These are all about, related offenses. So for an example, in this like later stuff about abandoning the marks of the householder, what does this mean? An inner garment like a householder's should not be worn, nor an inner garment that's a single color, nor an inner garment that's white, or nor an inner garment that have fringes on it, things that look like how lay people dress. These don't seem even rudimentarily to have anything to do with the 10 like normal novice precepts, right? Fringes doesn't really have anything to do with like killing or stealing or wearing perfume. This is the same for the other novel precepts. They cover things like prohibited hairstyles and robe colors, not giving toothwood or other service to people with defective morals, how to properly use the bathroom, not paying homage even in mantras to other gods, specifically like Vishnu, not reciting Sankhyan treatises, so like texts of other classical Indian non-Buddhist groups, thinking that they're true, and then rules for like how novices should attend the fortnightly Poshita ceremony and things like that. These are all essentially in the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya, but none of them are related to our novice precepts. So where do they come from? How do you know what it is? There isn't a sort of like Buddha Vachana canonical explanation that's like, these are the related precepts for novices. But they are, essential to how Щākyaprabhā organizes his text, essential in how he purveys sort of like offenses and like how he organizes things, and the fact that he has 4 sort of bonus novice precepts. Luckily, we get in his introduction a definition of what constitutes related rules. I'm going to have some water for a second, because it's going to be more text than normally one likes to put on a PowerPoint slide. He quotes a text called the Vibhāṣa. I'm going to read this once, and then that'll be it. The characteristic of what is related is stated in the Vibhāṣa: keeping extra robes and bowls, being separated from one's robes, and likewise cutting into the earth, touching jewels, lighting a fire, eating after being finished, cutting living plants, climbing a tree, eating food that was not formally accepted, discarding bodily waste on a spot with greenery, and likewise eating stored food and destroying seeds. Other than those 13 things, and the 10 novice precepts that we all know, killing, stealing, sex, lying, the prescriptions of the Pratimoksha Sutra for monks should be understood as what is related to what is taken. So dwelling together for the rains and the Poshita and Pravarana ceremony are connected with what was taken, as is what is produced from the basis of the mark, i.e. the mark of being a monk, begging, instruments, consumption, excitement, desire, harm, cohabitation, disrespect, and impurity. So this is all related stuff. Pratimoksha rules that are relevant minus these 13 exceptions. So this is going to cover things like being allowed to hold the Poshita and Pravarana, sort of like religious ceremonies, and then whatever this mysterious thing is, rules produced from the basis of the mark of being a monk, begging monastic instruments, and so on. Щākyaprabhā provides examples of what are related to the 10 sort of like normal novice precepts. So things that are related to killing are, not rejecting the basis of anger, harming, traveling in an army, hitting, producing regrets, food, creating fear, and so on. So these things he clearly states like these are related to killing. And then these are in his section on killing. And then he does the same thing for this sort of produced from the bases. So, produced from the basis of begging in instruments are related to abandoning touching gold and silver, or like jewels and valuables. So those produced from the basis of begging are begging people to robe fabric that you shouldn't have. Produced from the basis of instruments are having a fancy needle case made, something you are also not allowed to do. And he puts those things in that section. And for our additional bonus precepts, he clarifies that these all fall under the category of what is produced from the basis of the mark, i.e. the mark of being a monk, disrespect, and impurity. So, his additional precepts all come directly from this stuff that is given in this quotation from the Vibhāṣa. So what is it? We have a Vibhāṣa preserved of the Sarvāstivādin school for the Vinaya in Chinese. It is not that. People may know of this text, a pretty authoritative Abhidharma text called the Mahavibhāṣa or Abhidharma Mahavibhāṣa, translated multiple times into Chinese, written in the 2nd century CE, but it's not from that either. We know that Vibhāṣas are kind of like a cool style of commentary that happens in the Sarvāstivādin school, but none of these are the source of the Vibhāṣa that we know. They're from a Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinayavibhāṣa. We can know from Щākyaprabha's's text that the author of this text is Upagupta. It shows up in a couple different names and is mentioned in a variety of other Vinaya commentaries, one by Gunaprabha and then a couple other people. And we get Vinayavibhāṣa people referenced in an Abhidharma Kosha commentary of Yashomitra. So based on this information, Vinayavibhāṣa seems to be older than all of the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya commentaries we know. Somewhere, Tarnath or Bhutan, I think, says it said that Upagupta was Gunaprabha's teacher, but that doesn't make sense because he lived too long before him. So, chronology. Speaking of Gunaprabha, he's the other two of our two worthies of, together with Щākyaprabha, paired with all of those, 6 ornaments. We know he lived in the 5th to 7th century CE, and he wrote a traditional Sanskrit style sutra text. So this is like a Buddhist crew, probably, or Buddhist informed crew, who thinks the sutras of sort of narrative stories. This is like a sutra. So it's just short words and half sentences. He condenses the entire Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya into a whole bunch of these little fragmented phrases. It's extant in both Sanskrit and Tibetan, and he's probably the most influential Mūlasarvāstivādin commentator. Everybody refers to him. All the texts say how great Gunaprabha is and how they're following in his footsteps. He has an auto-commentary to his texts. Auto-commentaries are great because otherwise you're just reading gibberish. We'll look at a sutra here in a second. In this auto-commentary, he provides a quotation that matches almost exactly the quotation in Щākyaprabha's's text, unidentified. He just says, it said, blah, 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 blah. And we have similar verses quoted in 3 other Vinaya Sutra commentaries, or commentaries that, in the latter case here, at least partially comment on these sutras. And if we look at all these verses all go around the same sutra. Luckily, we have the Vinaya Sutra in Sanskrit and Tibetan, so we can take a look at what it says. It says, Tatpakshanam Manasam. This is 2 words in Sanskrit. Once we fill in all the missing information, which is how sutras work, it says, there is a mental misdeed to be resolved for what is related to the precepts, for probationary nuns and male and female novices. So this is about the thing we're talking about, related precepts. Just as a note, this sort of mental thing, this is just the same offense that it is for Щākyaprabha. Now, if we look at the sutra, as I said, just blub, 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 little blurbs of texts. And the Tibetan just goes on to the next sutra. But in the Sanskrit, it has verses. Very strange for the Vinaya Sutra. It doesn't normally have verses in it. And the verses are only extant in the Sanskrit versions we have of the Vinaya Sutra. The Tibetan version does not have them there. As you probably can figure out based on where this talk is going, these are the same. The one that is here is missing the last verse, the one that Щākyaprabha uses. However, At the very end of Sanskrit manuscripts, again only, not the Tibetan versions of the Vinaya Sutra, we have a little section called the Vinaya Karma-Sangraha-Karika, or verses on the collection of Vinaya ecclesiastical acts. Nobody really has talked about this text, maybe because it's only in Sanskrit, not in Tibetan, I do not know. The very beginning of this verse collection is exactly the verses that we have in Щākyaprabha's's auto-commentary. Luckily, we have one more source of this, because the Vinaya Sutra auto-commentary, which is fully in Tibetan, is partially in Sanskrit, one in like an Indic script, and the other written in cursive Tibetan transliteration. So this is Sanskrit written in Tibetan. Now, this is a thing for manuscript heads out there, people who love manuscripts and or want to get into manuscripts. They're full of mistakes. I think people have this idea that like people are like writing manuscripts and they're like, all right, and they sit down and they meditate for 4 hours and then everything's clear and they write everything out perfectly. But often there's lots and lots of errors and stuff, especially when people are like transliterating into other languages, things get like a little bit rough. But we have multiple versions of this, so we can put them together. I'm not going to read this into sort of like a sensible Sanskrit verse collection. I'm going to read this big block of text one more time, but only the one on the right. So this is from the Vinaya Sutra auto-commentary / collection of verses at the end of the Sanskrit manuscripts of the Vinaya Sutra. Keeping extra robes and bowls, being separated from one's robes, lighting a fire, eating again when finished, destroying seeds, discarding impure bodily functions onto a place with greenery, climbing a tree, are the precepts here for probationary nuns. The commentary tells us to add this. Together with, for the 2 prescriptions for male and female novices, touching jewels, eating of stored food, and food not formally accepted, and cutting into the ground and living plants. And then we have the same stuff. Excluding these, what is taken is contained in the Pratimoksha Sutra. Dwelling together for the rains, the Poshada, together with the Pravarna ceremony, are connected with what is taken, as is what is produced from the basis of the mark, begging, instruments, consumption, excitement, desire, harm, cohabitation, disrespect, and impurity. So the what is produced from section is identical. All of the same exceptions are given in all these texts. So presumably we just have slightly different versions of things. The order is slightly different. We just take a little dance around here. We see destroying seeds in different places, cutting into the earth in different places, touching jewels in different places. This seems to be because the version of this that Gunaprabha knows splits things up. So it splits things up for probationary nuns, shikshamanas, at the beginning, and then has all the novice business after that. Щākyaprabha's's, though, just lumps them all together. So we have this, are the precepts. We don't have any of this business in Щākyaprabha's's text. The other difference is that the Vinaya Sutra doesn't say specifically like the 10 novice precepts are excluded, but all the commentaries say the 10 novice precepts are excluded. So it seems that that was just understood. So what do we have? We have 2 slightly different versions of this Vinayavibhāṣa quotation. We have one partial and one full in the, I can't quite underestimate how important it is in Vinaya land, the Vinaya Sutra. Full one from an unstudied series of verses at the end of the Sanskrit manuscripts. We also have it preserved in Vinaya Sutra commentaries, and then we have a slightly different version of it in the Prabhavati. So we have this Vinayavibhāṣa text, its verses quoted in 5 important Indic commentaries and explicitly cited by Щākyaprabhā as his source for his related precepts, which are essential for his structure and organization of his text that summarizes the whole Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya for novices. The 10 novice precepts that are normal have a related section, and he has 4 bonus precepts that aren't other places that explicitly come from these sources in the Vinayavibhāṣa. So for people who love such things, we have access to a Sanskrit source for this organizational system. So Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya is big. We would take one thing out of this, it's that. And it's filled with rules and regulations across the whole thing. It's not neatly organized in terms of collecting things together. So how do you use it? You use commentaries and you use digests if you use it. Щākyaprabhā bookends his work with a few verses that mention the ocean of Vinaya. In his introduction, he says, I faithfully pay homage to the noble Gunaprabha, who we now know everybody loves, author of the Vinaya Sutra, Upagupta, author of the Vinayavibhāṣa, Chandramani, you don't really know anything about him, and so on, the creators of commentaries. I will explain the meaning of the Karika for novices, together with meaning of words in a manner which expounds upon what needs fulfilling. Having thoroughly investigated all the various kinds of commentaries, I, whose morality has not crossed over the ocean of the Vinaya, because of those frightening crocodiles, produce a yearning faith to ford the entrance together with my companions. So once in a while, Щākyaprabha'sArrangement sounds pretty good. It's not all just like, if you kill and you're paying attention, sometimes he gets fancy. And then the very last verse of his text, out of respect to Shakyamitra, the radiant gems of the training spoken by the Sugata were collected from inside the ocean of the Vinaya. And having separated the trainings with Indravajra meter, they are strung into a mala according to the divisions of the group of the Mūlasarvāstivādins. And in his commentary, he says, the Vinaya indeed is an ocean, because the ocean of texts is difficult to understand, it being the abode of many makara, or sea creatures. So, Щākyaprabhā summarizes the rules for novices throughout the huge MSV into 238 verses. He organizes his pretty influential texts around the ideas of related precepts. He adds 4 new precepts. Sources for these are this Vinayavibhāṣa. We don't have it. It seems that it is our earliest known Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya commentary. This source is also influential on arguably the most important Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya commentary text, the Vinaya Sutra. And we see that it shows up in a bunch of different manuscripts, explicitly Sanskrit versions of them in the Sanskrit versions of the Vinaya Sutra. And so now we know we have some of it, at least, preserved in Sanskrit. So hopefully further study of these quotations from the Vinayavibhāṣa can give us further insights into early Mūlasarvāstivādan Vinaya commentaries. Thank you.
So we'll have a short question and answer session now. If you have any questions, please feel free.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was very dense.
It is very dense.
Would you share with us the PDF or the document?
Certainly.
Sure, thank you. I wanted to ask you also, you probably heard about the story when Ananda, the disciple of the Buddha, asked if the Vinaya would change or evolve around time. Could you look at that code, or where is it?
It is, I believe, in the Kshujaka Vastu section of the Vinaya. He kind of like lays down, I haven't included it here, but there's like a 15th section. It's not officially a precept, and it's like the abridged Vinaya, which is like, if what you're doing is concordant with what the Buddha has taught and not discordant with what the Buddha has taught, then it's okay. And then you get the opposite of it. So if it's discordant with what the Buddha taught and it's concordant with what he didn't teach, then it's not okay. So this is, I believe, the Kshujaka Vastu or Vinaya Kshujaka section. It's from the same sort of like section where he talks about this sort of stuff. Admittedly, it's 2 volumes, so one needs to dig around a little bit. It's perhaps before the Parinirvana, but I do not remember off the top of my head.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned Ananda, so I would like to ask about Upali, if you can say some words, that he was the first one to, attributed to recite all the Vinaya, and if he's revered by Щākyaprabhā and Gunaprabhā in the later times.
Yes, so he's as Ananda is to the Sutra section, so he is to the Vinaya section, thought to recite to the Vinaya. I don't believe that he is personally mentioned in Щākyaprabhā's text, although it might be the case. At the very end of the Prabhavati, he gives kind of like a brief history of like final councils and stuff like that. So including like the death of the Buddha and like whether the 18 schools are all equally Buddha Vachana, even if they're not Mūlasarvāstivādins. And so I think he does mention him narratively in like that story. But he tends not to show up in sort of like discussions of like rules and things like that, although occasionally people sort of like pay homage to him. in sections in their text, but not in the way they don't say like Upali said. However, one of the 11 texts in the Uttara Grantha is the Upali Paripricha, or Questions of Upali. And so he gets quoted a lot because Vinaya commentators like that text in the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya, because it's got all the nitty-gritty stuff in it. So he gets references in there as well. I cannot see what it says from here.
Yeah, we have a question from Upali Shaman. He says,
oh, are they referred to as Shikshapada? Yes. So the way that it's sort of like structured is that he refers to them as precepts or trainings or Shikshapada, or however one would like to translate that term. The way that the text is organized, it says like the precept on blah 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 is over. So he does it for all of the like precept sections. So he says like the section on the precept of killing is finished, and then he does the same thing for stealing and then sex and lying about supernatural stuff. And then at the end, he does it for the, sorry, I guess this is online. I should be looking into the camera. At the end, he does it for the related precepts. So it's like the precept, the Shikshapada on what is related to abandoning the marks of the householder and stuff. So they are explicitly referred to as those, yes. Same with the other commentary that uses his as his base. They also refer to them as precepts as well.
we have one more online question. Chen Wu, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Chris. It was a wonderful talk. I'm just wondering, because you mentioned like Vinaya has the extensive, particularly MCV, Mūlasarvāstivāda has the substantial narrative passages, and that narrative are essential for modern scholars. Like we trying to recreate the history of the monastic societies. But do you think that those narrative attracted those commentators' attention or not? I mean, how they deal with these substantial narratives? Because based on my experience reading the Vinaya Sutra, I think the Guna Prabhupada's interest are more like the rule itself. The substantial narratives become just like a blurred away. But so I'm just wondering how this commentator or commentary traditions deal with these narratives.
That's a good question. So for narratives around, like the councils and stuff, which is part of the Vinaya, they will sometimes sort of like put those at the end of the text. So they will like use that sort of like narrative material. But it does kind of come into play. So the example that I gave of the Vibhanga, where like the monks start dying / hiring assassins, Щākyaprabha'sArrangement does talk about that. And it's like, did the Buddha know that it was going to happen? Right. So that's like the narrative as we have it. And like later commentators are obviously being like, well, like, is this cool? And then they explain essentially that like he had like awareness that it was going to happen based on like previous like karmic activities. And occasionally we'll do things like talk about narrative material. And Щākyaprabha'sArrangement especially will like wander a little into Abhidharma. I'm not an Abhidharma specialist, but he'll make sure that like stuff works okay Abhidharmically. And so we do sometimes get like specific like narrative stuff like pulled into that territory. Same with things like whatever the sins of immediate retribution, which show up in like some stories, which is like when you do something like so bad that like there is an immediate karmic response to it. Those tend to happen in narrative situations as well. And Щākyaprabha'sArrangement similarly like talks about that sort of stuff. Guna Prabha, less so in my experience, although admittedly the Vinaya Sutra like autocommentary is like 2 volumes in Tibetan, so it's like pretty big. So while I've done some wandering around in it, I definitely have not read the whole thing. Someday, perhaps. I'm just kidding, that's never gonna happen.
Thank you, Chris. This is out of just curiosity. So there is a debate between the Mūlasarvāstivādin and the Śrāvastivādin school, like Mūla added to Śrāvastivādin school. So I was just curious, and as you mentioned, that the Vinaya survives only in the Mūlasarvāstivādin, Dharmagupta, and Theravadin. So are there like crossovers in terms of reading Vinayas of different schools and accepting or rejecting other schools' precepts amongst the different schools?
That is a good question. In terms of like specifically like rejecting, I don't know that I have read a particular like Vinaya style thing where like it's like the whatever, the Dharmaguptaka people do this, like is that okay? You do see things like people say, some people say, and then they'll like put out a position, and then they'll like argue against it. The problem with that in Indian texts is that that doesn't necessarily mean anybody's saying it, because it is sort of like a debate style where you say like, some people say, what if this happened? And then you like respond to it. But that doesn't mean that anybody was really saying it, just that you want to like argue against it. You do occasionally see like references to other texts, but in my experience, it's usually like within a tradition. So Щākyaprabhā will say like, he says like in some books of the Vinitaka, which means like one, he uses the term book, so that's fun. And two, it means that like he knows that there's like multiple versions of a text, probably in Nalanda or wherever, where there were multiple versions of lots of texts. Sometimes people will say like this version of it is right, and sometimes people will say like, whatever. And then it's and then it's fine. So you get sort of like both sides of that. But in my experience, it's more sort of like a Mūlasarvāstivādin thing, and not a sort of like, let's give the Dharmaguptakas, you know, problems kind of way. Androni.
Yeah, I was wondering if there are formal constraints on what counts as a Vinaya Sutra to begin with. I ask this because in effect, philosophically, Buddhists don't actually accept something that's just written down as pramana, as proper knowledge. So in this instance, what really counts as a sutra? What legitimizes it as a rule that must be followed?
Essentially, what legitimizes it is that your teacher taught it to you, as is often the case in these kind of scenarios, but also that you're sort of like following along previous commentators, right? So the work of like previous commentators are thought to be like pretty authoritative. We see Щākyaprabhā, and I didn't like include it, but he like pays homage to like various groups of people who are teachers and stuff. Now, you do theoretically have there are like techniques to determine if something is like a proper teaching or an improper teaching. And you sort of like put various like techniques into it. But you don't really, in my experience, see too much of that on like the Vinaya side of things. Things are kind of like accepted because like you're just like writing within the tradition, at least in terms of like what people are writing down. In terms of like what people thought, who knows?
I have some vague awareness that in early Buddhism, there were also many Abhidharmas floating around. To what extent were different Abhidharmas associated with specific Vinayas?
Ooh, that is a good question. So some debate about the relationship between Mūlasarvāstivādins and Sarvāstivādins. Some people have written articles being like, they're the same people. One of the arguments for that is that Щākyaprabhā, sometimes the title doesn't have Mūla in it. But if the author had read the text, he would see that he explicitly says, I used the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya. So it could just be that, and we don't really know. It seems that when Щākyaprabhā, for example, like talks about Abhidharmic stuff, it seems like stuff that's in like the Vinayavibhāṣa or the Janaprastha or like Sarvāstivāda and Abhidharma text. So it seems like the stuff that he's talking about is in that sort of like line of continuity. Now, do the Mūlasarvāstivādins have their own Abhidharma? Some people argue that maybe they are Sautrantikas. And so, the relationship to Abhidharma is like not the same as it would be on the Sarvāstivādin side of thing. All of those sort of Sarvāstivāda, Mūlasarvāstivāda things are kind of bad, I think, because we don't really have enough information to make definitive statements about it. And there's no reason that like Mūlasarvāstivādins can't just consider themselves Sarvāstivādin. Like just because we're like they're different, it doesn't mean that everybody within the tradition thought they were different. So it probably is you had people that would use the Sarvāstivāda Abhidharma and so on. Vinaya proper doesn't wander too much into that discussion, and we don't have too much in the way of like commentaries of other schools. I believe, not as a Theravādan specialist, that on the Theravādan side of things, then things like work together in their commentaries. So, like Mahāviharan, Vinaya stuff is trying to like work okay together with like how Abhidhamma works in like a Theravādan system. My impression is that we don't quite have enough of the other schools in their commentaries. Even like the Sarvāstivāda Vinaya in Chinese translation is just like the Vinaya in 10 parts. Like it's associated with the Sarvāstivāda. It's not called the Sarvāstivāda Vinaya. So all of our sort of like those like lines are like pretty mushy, I think, in the real world.
Angela, I think there was another question.
Oh, does Щākyaprabhā use any narrative that doesn't have a parallel in the Vibhanga? So I said that all this stuff comes from essentially the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya. Occasionally we have things that we don't have anymore. I guess I am still theoretically sharing my slide. So if I can successfully share my actual like PowerPoints and we wander over into that section. These are all essentially in the MSV. So there isn't really rules for how novices should do the Poshada. They're supposed to do it, but the Vinaya doesn't have it in it. And so Щākyaprabhā in this section like lays out like what you should do. Also, there isn't a rule about like how you shouldn't pay homage. You shouldn't pay homage to gods, certainly. That's in the Vinaya, because like they don't have the same kind of like vow as you, and so they're not like older in ordination terms, and therefore you shouldn't pay homage to them. But there isn't really the mantra version of stuff. But this is in a text quoted by Gunaprabha in his auto-commentary. So he knows the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya that has like this information in it. There is also a little bit of narrative not giving toothwood to. So Щākyaprabhā quotes a text called, I don't know, the Manavaka Paripracha, not a text that exists anymore, where essentially it says like, there was this monk and he saw this like real bad guy and he was like, hey, can I have some toothwood? And he gave him toothwood. Toothwood's just like tooth, you chew to clean your teeth. And then he like serves on him and he helps him like find housing and stuff. And then it talks about how he like dies and goes to hell for like kotis, like millions of years. So there's this like fun little narrative there, but we don't have it. Like, so Щākyaprabhā quotes it. He knows of Vinaya that has it. But as far as I'm aware, it's not in the Tibetan or Chinese Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinayas. So they are out there and they're fun based on the versions that I've seen, but not currently extant. We are occasionally wrangling up more versions of things, identifying texts in Dunhuang and things like that. But yeah, thank you. A good question. And I get to talk about people going to hell for millions of years for sharing toothwood, and that makes me happy.
Thank you for your time and your valuable insight. We surely learned a lot about Vinaya, so thank you very much. And please kindly offer our offering from right. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. Have a good evening. See you.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate everyone being here.